This is Rabbi Jeff Sachs of Atid and WebYeshiva with another installment in our Jews, Judaism, and Modernity series. Good evening, everyone. We are going to be discussing tonight, leading into a few related sessions, we're going to be discussing tonight Reform Judaism. My concern with talking about the Reform movement and its arisal in Germany is both, of course, to discuss this very significant movement in the history of Judaism, and it really is very much a test case in the Jewish encounter with modernity, but it also is an opportunity to discuss some related issues, including what the Orthodox response to reform was, and we'll get to that hopefully in subsequent sessions. Reform Judaism is the first modern interpretation of Judaism, and it's significant for our purposes because it emerges after the events of the emancipation of the Jews. There's a new social reality, there's a new socio-political reality for the Jewish community, and there are now options for the Jew to enter general society. Remember, in the pre-modern world, a Jew's right to residence was only granted to him through the community, was only granted to him through his being a member of the larger Jewish community. He had no rights as an individual. The Jews were, in times more, times less, and times not, sometimes not at all, but in places where Jews were allowed to live, they were a tolerated minority, and the king or the duke or whomever was that was in charge said, we're going to allow the Jews to live here, we're going to allow a certain amount of Jews to live here, we're going to allow Jews to live here under the following conditions, and you were allowed right of residence wherever that was by dint of your membership in the larger Jewish community. Now, after the Ancien regime, now after the emancipation, Jews are citizens. They have the same rights of residency as any other Frenchman, as any other German, as any other fill in the blank. And that creates a freedom to think from scratch about one as an individual and a person's relationship to Judaism as being independent or no longer rooted in this question of my membership as a part of the Jewish community, which means my conformity with halacha, my conformity with normative Jewish practice, is no longer my my meal ticket, as it were, or not meal ticket, but it's no longer my my point of entree to being able to live here. Again, folks, if you have a webcam, please hit the send video button on the video panel. I see that very few of you have it on tonight, and as I always say, it really enhances the experience for all of us. So please hit the send video button if you have it. Okay. So reform, again, there are really only two options for a Jew after the emancipation. Either he can convert, which many Jews did. I think I mentioned a number of sessions ago this book, The Pity of It All, which is a history of the Yekkis. It's a history of German Jewry up to the onset of the Holocaust, and the rates of conversion, of meaningless conversions, people who converted to Christianity, but who were culturally, I mean, they were no longer observant. They would no longer be called what we today call Orthodox, but culturally Jewish, socially Jewish, but convert for convenience. And then, of course, the tragedy of that leading to subsequent generations of Jews who just disappear. The children of these people that I'm describing, of course, don't maintain that cultural, social connection to Judaism, but are Christians, in all forms. So there are two options for a Jew in the modern world. Either he can convert, or he can start this conversation about what would it mean to reform Judaism itself, so that Judaism now can be more palatable with being a Jew, can be more palatable with being a member of general society on equal standing. These were some of the topics that are already hinted at in the discussion of the Sanhedrin, of Napoleon's Sanhedrin, and that conversation keeps going with a lot of fervor, focused largely in Germany. That effort to reform Judaism itself is, of course, focused on the halakha, on normative Jewish practice, so that the reform movement becomes an assertion of the legitimacy to change Jewish practice, a denial of the eternality of the conventional received notion of, or the conventional received formulation of halakha. The first reformers, and only later does any movement take on a name. But the first people that we would identify as the proto-reformers of the reform movement were lay people working without rabbinic leadership, and their primary concerns were trying to stem the tide of defectors from Judaism, of trying to prevent conversion out of Judaism, and they look to an array of things in Jewish life and culture and practice that are perceived as being very much unaesthetic, as perceived as lacking a certain decorum. Certainly, aesthetics and decorum is defined by general German society in the early part of the 19th century. A lot of these things are focused on tefillah, on the Jewish prayer service, on the synagogue, on the Beit Knesset, and therefore you see early attempts to abbreviate davening, that sermons should be delivered in German, not in Yiddish, that there should be choral singing, that there should be vernacular prayers, that prayer should take place in German, not in Hebrew or in Yiddish. Later you see things like the kind of cutting and pasting of church service to synagogue service, the introduction of the organ. But even when the organ is first introduced, it was played by a non-Jewish organ player. We were talking about people that were still, at least in the public sphere of how they were going to organize communal life, had some type of commitment to an outline of halachic norms. That doesn't mean that every person was shomer Shabbat in their own home, but there was a notion that the synagogue, of course, if there'd be an organ, it would be played by a non-Jew. The New Israelite Temple of Hamburg You see here is a picture of an engraving of it. The New Israelite Temple of Hamburg is dedicated in 1818, and it's the first, Reformed synagogue with a capital R. And it is made by Israel Jacobson, by this fellow Israel Jacobson, who actually is making an effort to try to show that the reforms that they are advocating are actually compatible with halakha. They don't want to break with the traditionalists entirely. And there's a fear, they actually were very concerned with not being viewed as a separate sect. Shortly after the dedication of the synagogue, of the temple, but make a note of the name, the New Israelite Temple. There's something significant about every word in the title. New, to indicate that it's not old, it's not old-fashioned, it's not the shtibel, it's not the old type of synagogue. Israelite becomes the preferred term instead of Jew. Jew, of course, or Jewish, or Juden had taken on a certain, I guess, pejorative connotation, and Israelite sounded like it was a throwback to biblical Israel, and it seemed a more ennobled, enlightened title or name for the community. And note that it's a temple. It's not a shul. In Yiddish, a shul. A shul, of course, is Yiddish from the same root as school. A shul is not a temple. A shul is not even what in America we used to call a synagogue, even though we often did call the synagogue also the shul. But in its 19th century guise, a shul was a base medrash. It was a shtibel. What do you call it in Yiddish? Shtibel. Shtibel literally means a house or a little house, a minyan that meets in some kind of location, but not in a grand edifice with stained glass windows and whatever type of architectural grandeur that the New Israelite Temple in Hamburg did. Temple, of course, is a reference to the Beit HaMikdash. So, in other words, if you're going to have a synagogue, it's going to be on the order of the temple. Later, because there'll be discussion about de-emphasizing the messianic element in Judaism, this takes on another layer of meaning, insofar that if the movement will de-emphasize the notion of return to Israel and de-emphasize the notion of the return of Mashiach and the building of the Beit Shlishi, that we anticipate the building of the third temple. This was a statement to say, no, this is now the temple. Although I don't believe that that's the original intention, initially, to say that in the calling of the name temple. In 1819, you have the first edition of what's called the Hamburg Siddur, a special siddur that reflects the liturgy as practiced in the Hamburg Shul and amongst the reformists. Of course, the traditionalist camp opposes this, and they don't allow the use of the siddur. But the opposition is tricky, and the conflict between the traditionalist camp and the reformist camp is very much in the beginning an attempt to try to see if we can't find a way to all stay together. Clearly, aesthetics are not the only motivation. There are certain ideological or dogmatic considerations at play that are motivating some of the reforms. There's in the Siddur, for example, if you look in the Siddur, or it's an interesting comparison. When I taught high school in America, I actually once did this. I taught in an Orthodox day school, and I xeroxed the Shmona Esrei from a contemporary Reform Siddur. I asked the students to compare the differences between the conventional Nusach Hatzfilah that they were all accustomed to, having grown up and been educated in an Orthodox setting, to the version of the Amidah, the central prayer, as it appears in the contemporary Reform synagogue. And all of those reforms, the kernel of them, are already present in this 1819 Siddur. There's a de-emphasis on Shivat Zion. There's a de-emphasis on the return to Israel. There's a de-emphasis, there's a lack of the notion of the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash. There's a lack of notion of the korbanot, the sacrificial order, which is either removed or framed in a more allegorical kind of notion. And the Siddur reforms all reflect this. Again, although initially started by laymen, scholars and rabbis join in the second wave of the Reform movement from, let's say, the 1830s or the mid-1830s and on. In 1839, Abraham Geiger, there you go. I always there's something about his picture. Maybe it's the pictures of people from that era. This is the first generation that we have photographs of. I'm not sure exactly what year this picture is taken, but let's say it's sometime in the 1840s, 1850s. It's the first generation where you have photographic portraiture, and there's something about those pictures. I mean, it could be, like Abraham Lincoln we're looking at. There's something about pictures from that era. There's something about Abraham Geiger. Maybe it's that churlish smile. Maybe it's the long hair or the sideburns. I'm not sure, but there's something about the picture of Abraham Geiger that always gives me a chuckle. Abraham Geiger lives 1810 to 1874. He is the true spiritual father of the Reform movement. Although again, others before him got the ball rolling, but he's the true spiritual father of the Reform movement. And he puts forth an argument that Judaism is a constantly evolving organism. Biblical Judaism is not the same as the Judaism of Chazal, and Judaism always was evolving, he points out, and therefore modern Judaism need not be equal to rabbinic Judaism, to the Judaism of Chazal or of the Rishonim. And he introduces, or advocates rather, a critical approach to the study of Tanakh. He tries to show evidence of change within Tanakh. However, he thinks that change within halacha, change to the normative practice of halacha, should be very gradual. It should be evolutionary and not revolutionary. He's very concerned that he and his followers should not be viewed as a sectarian movement, as breaking off with mainstream Judaism. He's radical in his views, but conservative in his approach. He remains basically traditional in terms of the liturgy, in terms of his own personal practice, but he makes this argument that the nature of Jewish people is subject to change. He makes an argument that once we were a nation, now we're only a people, This might be splitting of semantic hairs, but you hear echoes of what we read in Napoleon's Sanhedrin here, to say that we're a people like any other people, and we are fully integrated. We're not a separate nation amongst the nations. This, of course, largely it certainly all precedes modern political Zionism, but you can understand why the Reform movement was initially a strong opponent of Zionism, because they found their movement on the notion that we are fully integrated into our host society, and the notion of Zionism, the notion of returning to Israel, the notion of returning to Jewish autonomy is very much alien to what they're saying. And therefore also this notion that the idea of the Messiah, of Mashiach, of the Messianic era, should be kind of interpreted in a metaphorical way or a universalistic way, but not in the traditional way that the Messiah will come and redeem the Jewish people and lead them back to Israel. That's Geiger. His counterpart is, oops, well, I'll come back to this in a second. His counterpart is, here you go. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't have a picture of him. Samuel Holdheim. Samuel Holdheim, who lives from 1806 to 1860. He's just a couple of years older than Geiger, and Holdheim, I don't know why, I don't think I could find a picture of him. Holdheim is the counterpart to Geiger. Holdheim is the one who argues that the Reform movement should be revolutionary and not evolutionary. He makes an argument that the Chumash, that the Torah has really two parts: the ideas and the values that are eternally valid, and the things that are temporarily bound, things that are contextual to a certain time, a certain history, and those notions are not valid forever, he argues, but the kind of the things you can water down into universalistic values, that's the eternal component of the Torah. This is an idea that he actually bases on ideas that were put forth by Moses Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn had talked about notions that are zmaniot or historiot, temporal, things that are rooted in time, and things that are eternal. Holdheim takes it much further than Mendelssohn would have. But Holdheim argues that after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, all of those things were up for grabs. All of the time-rooted practices were really up for grabs. And it's only the religiously eternal message of Judaism, notions like monotheism, morality, those are the things that are eternally valuable. But all ceremonial law is up for grabs. It's out. And a group of Reform Jews in Berlin, which becomes the hotbed of the most radical reform, a group of reformers in Berlin adopt Holdheim's practices, and they start prayer services without a talit, without kippah, Brit Milah, which, even today, Brit Milah becomes, the symbol of connection to Judaism. And all surveys, of course, tell us that among the ritual practices that are most widely adhered to by Jews around the world, regardless of how assimilated they may be, Brit Milah is up there. Circumcision is up there. The Reform movement will backpedal on some of these things because there'll be a recognition that these things, even if again, I'm speaking in the voice of the Reform movement, not my own voice, but even if they're no longer theologically binding, even if they're no longer ritually binding, they're of value, and they have important social component or sociological component, so that Holdheim and this group of Berlin reformers do away with shofar on Rosh Hashanah. I doubt that there's a Reform temple in the world today that you would go on Rosh Hashanah and not hear the shofar. So the most radical reforms are not fully adopted. Perhaps most surprisingly, they move Shabbat. There's an attempt to move Shabbat to Sundays to bring the Sabbath day into line with the majority host society. Also, similarly, in their prayers, there's a complete de-emphasis on Yerushalayim and on Israel. Barbara, you asked, how did they determine? I think Holdheim was ready to do away with all things that weren't the embodiment of, the abstract ethical norms, and all ritual law was again up for grabs. I'm not sure exactly how each thing was decided. This argument against Zionism, against Israel, against Yerushalayim, finds a polemic response in a very, very well-known. I mean, it's well-known. You may know it. We can do a poll to see if you know this. Comment of the Meshech Chochma. The Meshech Chochma was a commentary on the Chumash by Rabbi Meir Simcha HaKohen Midvinsk, who lived in 1845-1926. I'm not certain exactly when this was written. I imagine that is something that we can determine. But it's a very well-known comment of the Meshech Chochma. Even if you've never read the Meshech Chochma, you're liable to have heard this. I'll say we're a little bit late, so I'll just skim ahead. There's a pasuk in Vayikra that says, "Va'af gam zot biyotem be'eretz oivehem lo ma'astim v'lo ga'altim l'chalotam." Even Hashem says to the Bnei Israel, when you'll be in Galut, when you'll be in the diaspora, in the lands of your enemies, even when you'll be there, and you're there because you're being punished. You've been sent into the exile as a punishment. Even there, lo ma'astim v'lo ga'altim. I won't l'chalotam. I won't abandon you. I won't despise you. L'hafer bruti itam. Ki ani Hashem Elokeichem. So the Meshech Chochma, in a lengthy comment about the nature of life in the exile, just one second. Okay, he has this famous comment that in the exile, Hayisraeli bechlal yishkach machzavato v'yachshav le'ezrach v'anan ya'azov limudei dato. What's going to happen? We'll go out into the exile. It's not that Hashem will leave us. We'll leave Him. We'll abandon the study of our religion. We'll study foreign languages. Yalif miklakta v'lo yalif mitakanta. We'll study the wrong things. We won't study the Torah. Yachshov ki Berlin hi Yerushalayim. And we'll think that Berlin is Jerusalem. The famous line, perhaps the most famous line in the whole commentary of the Meshech Chochma, this is obviously a polemical comment against the Reform. This notion that Berlin is the new Jerusalem, Germany is the new Eretz Yisrael, and we will abandon our hope for return. Ultimately, of course, although a long time after, the Reform movement does come back around to a Zionistic position, but initially it is devoid of all of those things. The Reform movement is initially, again, it's hard to talk about it as a movement. There's no one central There's no one central body. There's no one central leader. From the beginning, there's disagreement both about the content and the form, the content and the form of 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 the movement, and this leads to an attempt to try to garner some consensus. In 1844, there's the first conference in Brunswick, in Germany, to try to make some consensus about what this movement is meant to be, and there's a proposal to just adopt all of those Sanhedrin resolutions, but also, quite shocking, I think, to allow intermarriage. You remember the Sanhedrin did not allow intermarriage, although they said that, I mean, a kind of convoluted thing, the Sanhedrin had said, if a Jew marries a non-Jew, and if the Jew and a non-Jew have a civil marriage, so then that's binding civilly, although not recognized halachically, which is a kind of tautological argument. At a second conference, which is held in 1845, the following year in Frankfurt, there's a proposition to eliminate Hebrew. These are the minutes, as it were, of the convention to discuss the desirability, to what degree is the Hebrew language necessary for the public prayer service, and if not necessary, is its retention advisable for the time being. So this is an attempt to do away with Hebrew. This leads to a breakaway from the Reform movement. And the Reform movement is a splintered organization from the beginning. It leads Zacharias Frankel to break away and to start something that he calls the positive historical school of Judaism. He makes an argument that the halakha is no longer the sole basis of Judaism, but he says that we should base ourselves on what he called respect for patterns of behavior established by the halakha. In other words, the halakha not as binding law, but as a kind of intrinsic part of who we are, of what we have always done. And this actually becomes the part of the ideological foundation for what later will become the conservative movement in America. It's important to remember that the Reform movement begins in Germany, and the conservative movement begins in the United States. And there are different things about how each of those movements developed that are connected to their points of origin. But Frankel is already an early response to reform, moving a little bit to the right, saying that we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And he's a response to the most radical, the most extreme position in the reform spread from Germany to Hungary and to Western Europe, and then also to the United States. However, in 1848, remember these two big initial conferences are in 1844 and 1845. In 1848, there's a wave of revolutionary activity throughout Europe, and that halts the spread of of uh, of the reform movement for a period of time, because many of the leaders were actually accused of being behind these revolutions. Because of that, many of those leaders, both lay leaders and spiritual leaders of the reform movement, leave Europe and go to the United States, so that we see both a wave of German Jewish immigration to the United States in the mid-19th century, and in 1869 already, you have the first Reform Conference in the United States, and the Reform movement quickly establishes itself in the United States. You have here, wait a second. So here's the Hebrew is language of Jewish prayer, and then here's another. There's some discussion going on in the chat, which you're welcome to participate in. Here's another set of minutes from the 1845 conference about the question of messianism. The discussion of questions called question number 2. To what degree must the dogma of the Messiah and anything pertaining to it be I'm sorry for the quality of the scan, be taken into consideration in the liturgy? And the conclusion becomes, I invite you to take a look through this. It's the protocol of the session, so it reads like a transcript. You see, like the names of the different speakers. Hold on, let me just find a good quote here. In all contemporary additions to the prayer book, our modern conception of the Messiah may clearly be stated, including the confession that our newly gained status as citizens constitutes a partial fulfillment of our messianic hopes. So again, there's this notion of the reinterpretation of what Yemot HaMashiach is, that you could have us being admitted to the universities in Germany is itself the Atchalta de Geula, is a radical reinterpretation of thousands of years of Jewish theology. The resolution is that the Messianic idea should receive prominent mention in the prayers, but all petitions for our return to the land of our fathers and for the restoration of the Jewish state should be eliminated from the liturgy. This is a radical reinterpretation of the of Jewish thought. In some discussion in the chat, there's discussion about patrilineal descent. Matrilineal descent, that all comes later. Women wearing tefillin is also, in other words, it's true that in the conservative movement, women habitually put on tefillin, meaning women who put on tefillin. In other words, not all the men put on tefillin. In the Reform movement, there was this, as we saw, certainly amongst the most radical, there was this movement that nobody should be putting on tefillin, or nobody was putting on tefillin. So I guess there was de facto egalitarianism on that point. Now, again, I'm certainly aware that we all come from different places and we each have different backgrounds, and I'm sure that at different points some of us have encountered the contemporary Reform movement Um, and I mean, no, no disrespect in this presentation. Neither, of course, am I advocating on behalf of the reform movement. This is all by way of introduction, because these changes, which were really quite radical, even the moderate wing of the 19th century reform, or the first half of the 19th century, were really quite radical. Um, uh, the the response to the reform movement from the Orthodox camp took two general tracks. One was the more radical response uh, of the Orthodox. The other was a more moderate response, which in no way accepted the tenets of the Reform movement, but made some type of tacit recognition that Judaism was in need not of reforms with a capital R, but of improvement to make it consistent with halacha, but palatable and engaging with the modern world. These two positions were, I guess, most widely associated with the Chassam Sofer, Harav Moshe Sofer, on the radical camp, and of course Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch on the what came to be known as the neo-Orthodox camp. We sometimes point to that as a precursor to what we today call modern Orthodoxy, and those will be the topics for our next sessions. So this by way of introduction to get into the Orthodox response and to understand the Orthodox response to the Reform is in many ways an attempt to also understand the orthodoxies of today, because they have their roots. They have their roots there. Again, even the term Orthodox, to talk about the Orthodox movement, is a a neologism. Traditional Jews did not refer to themselves as Orthodox. When you're the only camp in town, you don't need a name for your movement because that's who you are. And in the pre-modern era, you didn't need to call yourself Orthodox. All you needed to do was call yourself Jewish, which didn't mean that everybody was exactly the same. Didn't mean that everybody did exactly the same thing, or certainly not thought the same way. But we understood who we were, what the community was. It's only with the advent of the Reform movement that a traditional camp needs a title to differentiate itself from the Reform movement, and as often happens, the title of the name given to a group is sometimes given by the opponents of that group. So that, again, like we pointed out, the Hasidim and the Misnagdim were the majority group. They were the old boys network. These Hasidim come along, these Johnny-come-latelys come along, and the Misnagdim, the opponents of Hasidim, take on a name, Misnagdim, that defines them in opposition to this new group. The same thing here. Orthodox is a term, it's a kind of tongue-in-cheek term that's given to the Orthodox camp by the opponents of the Orthodox camp. Orthodox meaning proper belief, as if to say, oh, they think that they have the proper sets of belief. And that will be our topic for our next session. I'm just going to look over some of these chats. Well, the question about why did they even bother having a temple, there was still a desire to keep an organized Jewish community. Now remember, we might think that their intentions were misplaced, but remember they were battling conversion out of Judaism. The idea of the reform was motivated by a desire to create a Judaism that one could subscribe to. One could still be a member of the organized Jewish community and yet still feel that they can be fully engaged in the larger secular society, and that their involvement or membership in Jewish community would not prevent the full immersion into German culture and society. So there's still a desire to keep an organized Jewish community. Organized Jewish community is and always has been traditionally in the synagogue. So the idea was how to create a synagogue that would be a new type of synagogue that would not have all of those kinds of pejorative or perceived unaesthetic or undecorous notions, that would allow you to be a synagogue goer, a temple goer, and still be a good German Mensch. The question about conversion, these are contemporary questions, not part of the context that we're talking about tonight, going back more than 150 years. Okay, again, this discussion about tefillin and tefillin wearing and women wearing tefillin is an important discussion, but it's divorced from the context of what we were talking about tonight, so I'm not going to get into that. Sherry, you're correct that all of these phenomena that we're talking about are exclusive to the Ashkenazi realm. Sephardic Jewry altogether don't enter the modern world for the purposes, I mean, if you go back in the archives to the very, very, very first session last semester, the question of what is modern Judaism, all of these questions of the Jews' encounter with modernity, these are questions that the Jews in the Sephardic lands don't encounter until the 20th century, sometimes the middle of the 20th century. So it's not surprising that the Sephardic communities remained a much more traditional